Hey everyone, welcome to this week's or one of this week's episodes of the Golden Path to Spring One. If you haven't been on any of the episodes before, you can go over to like VMware Tanzu's YouTube or Twitch or this Spring One on YouTube as well to be able to look at the videos that we already have up. You can see any of those links if you just go to tanzu.tv. I'll paste the link for this week's episode into the chat so you can. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming. We're basically doing a twice a week stream up until we have Spring One in August, which will be in person in Las Vegas. At the end, there will be a little thing that tells you a little bit more about it. So today we have Brian Benz, and we're going to be having a talk on deploying Spring Boot apps to Kubernetes with GitHub Actions and feature flags. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat, and I will be interjecting as we go along at the right times to ask Brian the questions. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, yeah, thank you. Brian Benz. I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft. And I'm actually based in Las Vegas, so very much looking forward to Spring One here in my hometown. So that'll be cool. Yeah, and I've been at Microsoft about 10 years. I've been working with Java since 1999 and a few other things. That's about it about me. But yeah, today I'm going to be presenting mostly demos. This is the only slide you're going to see. Actually, there's one more slide with some links, which I'll show at the end of the presentation so folks can catch up on what I'm showing. But pretty much everything here is demos, and we're going to start from zero, and I'm going to create a Spring Boot app that connects to Azure App Configuration, which is what we use to manage feature flags. And then after that, I'm going to Dockerize it. We're going to run it in Docker. I'm going to show you how to pass a parameter, an environment variable from your local machine to Docker to test it out. And then we're going to deploy it to a container registry, in this case, Azure Container Registry. And then we're going to deploy that to Kubernetes and show you how to deal with secrets that you need to add that connection string there. So I like it because it's like a real world demo that we're working with that allows you to, I can write a hello world app. Everyone's seen one of those, but it doesn't connect to anything and it's not really relevant for the real world. In the real world, you need to have applications that actually run. Sorry for the phone in the background there. And the application has to run and connect to something. So yeah.
Awesome. Looking forward to this. I'm going to hop off and let you do your thing.
All right. So let's get started with that. I'm going to switch my screen over here. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to start at the end. I'm going to show you the actual application. And this is it. This is all it is. It's a Spring Boot app. It's running on Kubernetes. And it just says my feature is enabled. And what this does is actually connects to a connection string that connects to an app configuration manager. So I've got another link here /message that goes to, it tells you where the actual app configuration manager is. And if I go into my Azure portal, so for those of you who might not be familiar, portal.azure.com. For those of you who are customers, you'll be familiar with it. For those of you who aren't, you can go to portal.azure.com and you can create a free trial and you can try out what I'm showing here in the video today with the GitHub repo. So the GitHub repo itself is at bbenz Spring Boot feature flags. And this is the portal. The portal itself, this is a resource group, this little square here. And inside the resource group, I'm down here. This is the one I've created that's blank for this demo. Down here, I created one that was finished. And inside of there, I've got a container registry and a Kubernetes service. And serving this is a app configuration manager called New Demo Features. And that actually connects to that little app I showed you. So this is the New Demo Features app configuration instance. And if I go into Feature Manager, I can see here that the beta flag is enabled. So that means the feature flag is enabled. And I'll go into why you want to use feature flags in a second. But this is how the app works. If I turn that off, it updates the feature flag, so it turns off the feature. And sometimes this takes a little bit, but when I refresh this a couple of times, there we go. My feature is disabled. So basically, it's a way to deploy multiple versions of an application in one deployment. That's what feature flags are good for. And in the case of Azure, you use app configuration for that. And you connect through a connection string that brings in the settings for your app configuration and your feature flags. So you could create a new version of the app. You could create a part of an app or in a website that only gets showed for a certain period of time or other things like that. Let's see. The features themselves, this is just a simple one called beta. I can also create other features. And this is where it gets really interesting. Demo, let's call it demo. You can use a feature filter. So you can target specific areas, users or groups or locations where the actual application should see the new feature versus the old feature. You can also do a time window. So if you have something you want to display on a website for a weekend, you can set it up so a time window will display that feature during that period of time. And when, in the case of what I've done for this code, it's just basically a really simple yes or no. It checks for the feature flag and turns on or off that message you saw there. But you could also do things like text blocks in your HTML pages or CSS or an entirely different class, a redirect that goes to a different page. And the redirect for the different page, for example, can be really good for percentages. So you can say percentage. And you can actually set up a percentage. So only 50% of the people will see the new feature and 50% of the people will see the old feature. And the cool thing about that is you can do A/B testing. So A/B testing is where some users see a version of your app or your website and the other people see the old version. And you can track what happens in all of those situations and see if the new feature is going to have the desired results in your app or your website or wherever you're building it. So that's just in a nutshell feature flags. Let's actually drill into the code here and I'll show you how it works. So the code itself, you go to start.spring.io. Some of you might be familiar with that site. And basically I created a Spring Boot 2, the latest version of Spring Boot 2. In this case, I think I used 2.7.3, and then I had a version, just a title. I used Java 11, and then you've got some dependencies here. You need the Spring Cloud app configuration config web. That's what manages all of your app configuration connections. And then you need Spring Cloud feature management web. And all this, by the way, is on the GitHub repo that I shared, and I'll share at the end of the presentation as well. And then Spring Boot Starter Web and Spring Boot Starter Test, those are pretty standard. And then Maven. That's it. There's not much in this POM. When you go into the actual code itself, if I go in here, the application itself is just using the standard Spring Boot application calls. Hello World controller, it sends a message, and this is the message I use when I go over here to check to make sure that I'm connecting to my connection string. So I can confirm that this app is actually connecting from the connection string out.
For this page, could you increase the font size?
Sure, this one?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, so it just says hello from new demo features azconfig.io. Now, when you look at the application on the back end, if I go into the portal, you'll see here in the, actually want to go here. I can discard those features. If I go into Configuration Explorer and I see this message, there it is, hello from, and it just tells you where it's coming from. So it just passes the value. It just confirms that I'm connecting. When you're doing troubleshooting, that's very useful. And the next thing, of course, is the feature flag itself. And that connects through basically some connection strings. If you go in the access keys, you'll see here, I won't show it obviously, but the connection strings right here. And I literally just copy this into an environment variable when I'm running locally. And then I'm going to show you how to take that environment variable and deploy it out to Kubernetes in a secret in a little bit as well. So that's that. And then this one just says my feature is disabled or my feature is enabled. And that code is in hello world features.java. And the hello world features basically creates the feature manager, which uses the app config and the feature manager web that we created in our POM dependencies. And it just checks to see when you go to the feature mapping, it just checks to see if that feature is enabled using the connection string that's built in to the application itself. So that's it. It's a really simple application, but you can build on that. This is a great base to build on to actually build into your application. So in the real world, of course, you already have an application you're using and maybe you want to add feature manager to it. I would focus on just looking at this hello world features class, just pull in whatever code is here and that'll help you set up your feature manager nice and quickly and easily. Okay, so that's how the feature works. So how do we actually get it going? Well, the first thing we do when you're working with local, I had to set up these are just my own notes here. Basically, you just do maven clean package and a Java jar, and it starts the application itself and runs. But I'm going to show you, the first demo I want to show you is actually just building it with Docker. And we'll go through the Dockerfile in a second here. So let's go ahead and build that. I'm using Visual Studio Code for this, and this is it's a Windows subsystem for Linux, WSL. It's Ubuntu 20. And basically all this does is build the Docker image. I'm calling it Spring Boot Docker. And we're going to actually take this image and we're going to deploy it to an Azure Container Registry in a little while. But this just actually builds and runs, and then you can pass the connection string. One tricky thing, so while this is building, for those of you who might not be familiar with sending connection strings or sharing parameters in your Docker file, this was the most ridiculous thing. So it had, when you look at this command here, and let me create that a little bit bigger, Docker run 8080. Okay, so that's the port we're going to run on. The app configuration connection string, that's the environment variable that I have locally that connects to that app configuration for you. And then you name Spring, you run Spring Boot Docker. This environment variable, it's natural tendency to add that at the end, right? Because a normal Docker run command is Docker run and then the name of the actual container that you want to run. But no, you have to put the environment variable before the name of the container. And if you don't do that, it doesn't give you an error message. It just tells you it can't find the environment variable, which is incredibly annoying, but that's the way it works. So that's a little tip. If there's anything you take away from this, if you want to pass environment variables to your Docker file, you do it using app configuration connection string. Use that before you use the name in your Docker. Pardon me. So let's go into the Docker file and I'll show you what that does while this is building. So the Docker file itself, it's from Maven. We use the Maven image from Docker Hub. JDK 11 Slim. We didn't need the full JDK, so that's okay. We run Maven clean package, just like you would on a local machine. I do dskip test equals true because that way we don't have to have the connection string in the Docker image. When I run this later, I'm going to show you how to set up GitHub Actions with this. And that becomes important because when you're running this in Docker in a what they call a hosted runner on GitHub Actions, out on the web in a cloud, it doesn't necessarily always have access to the connection string. So any testing you need to do testing locally. And then when I go to the Dockerfile, I do dskip tests, and that just skips any test that looks for that connection string. You still need the connection string to run the application. I'm going to show you how to pass that in your GitHub action later as well. Anyway, and then the package stage is just basically from OpenJDK. Once again, JRE this time, Slim, and it takes that snapshot and exposes port 8080, and then you can run this from here. So the command used to do that is docker run. All right, and it passes that configuration string to the Docker. You notice I don't have a reference to the connection string in the Docker Dockerfile itself. I don't need it. All I need is that connection string environment variable passed to the code in the Docker instance, not to the actual Docker file or anything like that. That's another reason why we use dskip tests. Okay, so that's running nice and quick because we're using the JRE. All right, and then I can go to localhost here and I can see that's not true. My feature is not enabled. My feature is disabled. But then I can go back to new demo features here and I can go to feature manager and I can enable that. And that feature flag's enabled. And then I am tap dancing for a second because, yeah, there we go. So my feature is enabled. So that's the idea. So you're running this on localhost, and then you have the local message as well. So you can check to make sure that you're connected to the connection string. Because this actually returns, I don't know if you noticed in the code, but if this actually returns your feature is disabled, even if it can't connect to the connection string. All right, so that is everything you need to know about running this locally. You can run it just from the command line, or you can set up the Docker. The Docker will run locally as well. So now that we know that the Docker runs locally, I already talked about the Dockerfile, but that's it there. So the next thing we want to do is we want to deploy this out to a container registry. So you can use Docker Hub. You can use any container registry. We have Azure Container Registry, which is actually originally based on Docker Hub. And if I look here, I've created a new, what I did to save time, because this takes sometimes a little bit of time. We only have an hour. And I created a container registry and a Kubernetes service. Sometimes the Kubernetes service can take 15, 20 minutes to set up. So that would be a problem for a live demo. So what I did is I created a container registry here. It's at spring1magic.azurecr.io. And inside of that container registry right now, there are no repositories. There's nothing here. So nothing up my sleeve. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to take my Docker that I just created. I'm going to push it out there, but I'm going to use a cool command to do that.
And quick question. Someone is asking why you aren't pushing the image to a local Docker registry for using Docker Compose later.
I guess you could do that. I just didn't really need to. So I'll show you the Azure command line, and hopefully that'll be a little more clear. So thanks for the question, though. Are there any more questions at the moment while we're on questions?
That's the first one I've seen so far.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I didn't use the local Docker registry because I could, but I'm going to show you a cool command that allows you to build and deploy out to a container registry with one line of code. So hopefully that is self-explanatory in a second here. So I created this container registry and the Kubernetes. I'll show you how I set those up in a little bit. But for now, what I want to do is I'm going to switch back to the commands. So I could have done, up here, I did a Docker build and a Docker run. Now I could do a Docker push to push this out to the container registry as well, or I can do this command, which is an Azure CLI command, AZACR Build. And what this is going to do, it's going to do a Docker build and a push. If the build is successful, it pushes this automatically out to the container registry for me and creates a new image in that container registry, all in one line. So let's go ahead and do that, and then I'll explain how I set that up. So AZACR build, that should work. Let's just make sure. Yeah, okay. So that's running. I think it's going to be all right. I've done this a little bit. I tried it last night just to make sure everything was working fine. So that's the other demo you saw there just at the beginning of the presentation, but this one should do it as well. So what this does is it actually creates, it builds, and it pushes things to what's called a hosted agent on Azure. So it's actually not using your machine to do the build. It's pushing up to a container in the cloud. It's going to do the build. It's going to make sure everything works, and then it's going to deploy it out to the container registry. Now, setting up the container registry was really easy. Let me show you what I did there. You just go plus. You can do this from the Azure command line as well, the Azure CLI. But in this case, I just say plus containers, and then container registry create. And then I can just say Spring One Magic. I can create a new name called Spring One Demo. I'm not actually going to create this right now, but it already knows where my resource group is, which is West US 3. I just use the standard SKU. We're not allowed to use basic. That's only for customers. And then for the next thing, basically, that's all I had to do. The next thing I had to do when I created this, I go back to the dashboard and I go into the container registry itself. And let's just check to make sure that build's working. Yeah, it built. Okay. The next thing I had to do was go into, I won't go in here right now, but basically you go into access keys and you enable your admin user. And that allows you to do the connection with your local machine and the container registry, because obviously not everyone can have access to the container registry. And then I did AZACR Login, and I connected to that. And then I did the AZACR Build. So I already did the login earlier, and the build deployed out to the container registry. So we look at that now. I showed you this earlier. It didn't have anything in there. Now it does. Yes, it does. Good. Hey, everything's working. This is the image that we're going to use for deploying out to Kubernetes. So also, the next thing, yeah.
Sorry. We have another question. Is it possible to upload Docker images into JFrog Artifactory and also use a JFrog scan? I'm not sure if that's something you know or not.
Yeah, no, it is. I've been doing a lot of co-presentations with Melissa McKay over there at JFrog. And yeah, it's you can totally use Artifactory and any of their CI/CD tools to connect and build this. In fact, I've got a separate presentation. If I get a chance at the end, I will show you a link. But if you search in YouTube, JFrog, Brian Benz, Melissa McKay, you'll find a whole presentation on actually using Artifactory and deploying things from there as well. There's a couple of little tricks you need to know there as well, using settings and passing GitHub Actions secrets. But check out that video. It's a totally separate topic and a whole hour all by itself. So I won't get into that too much, but hopefully that answers the question. All right. So the next thing we did the AZACR build, that deployed that. So the next thing I did is actually created a AKS instance. And to create the AKS instance, once again, you go into portal, dashboard, and I can say create, and then containers. You can do this through the Azure CLI as well. I did it this way. It's a kind of a long story, but for Microsoft employees, we don't always have access to all the resources in all the locations on Azure. Those are prioritized for customers, understandably. So sometimes when I run through things from the Azure CLI, I get an error message at the very end saying we couldn't provision this because this is there's at capacity for employees, not for customers. So in this case, I do prefer to do things in the portal. Plus, it just shows you graphically how you want to set everything up. So this is Azure Kubernetes Service. So Azure Kubernetes Service is Kubernetes. Microsoft manages the control plane, and you manage all your pods and clusters and things like that and deploy to it. And it connects really easy to Azure Container Registry, as you'll see. All right, so the resource group, we're going to use Spring Magic again. All right. Oh, what'd I do? Spring Magic. I can't spell. Spring Magic. There we go. Why it's not picking it, but yeah. Oh, God, I'll have to go through here. Spring One Magic, that's what it was. Oops. And then, so that picks the resource group, and then you have cluster preset. You can do dev tests. There's different options for pricing, and we're going to call this Spring One demo. And once again, it defaults to the West US 3. You got availability zones, which are automatically built in. So availability zones are a way to create an instance of your Kubernetes cluster in multiple locations. If you're using Kubernetes by yourself, you might have tried to do this. It's kind of challenging here. You just literally choose the availability zones that you want, and it will automatically set it up for you. There is a pricing tier. Once again, I can't use the free tier as an employee, but you can. You can do different versions, and you can automatically upgrade, which I highly recommend. The scale method, so I did auto scaling 1 to 5 nodes. They're going to be standard. It deploys 1 node by default. And then the next is the node pools. I just skip over this. I don't need it necessarily. I'm going to use the default encryption at rest for all of my data in here. And then the authentication authorization, you use local accounts with Kubernetes RBAC. Role-based access control is automatically set up for you. Another part of the service. Network configuration, you can use KubeNet or Azure CLI. I just leave the default. This is one important thing. Anybody who's tried to set up Nginx or other application routing, ingress control, all you have to do is click there, and it sets up the ingress control for you. You can create a private cluster. I'm not going to set any of this. I can keep it the way it is, but the only thing I added was enabling the application routing, and that's automatically going to set up ingress control for me. And then what I do is I go and I find the container registry that I already created. I can enable container monitoring. I just disabled it because it's a demo, but basically this is performance monitoring and security monitoring for your application. Azure policy. So this is a way for your administrators to manage policy. Anyway, that's it. I skip over the advanced part, and then I did review and create. I'm not going to create it because I already did. But that's basically the steps I had to go through to create this. And then it runs for 10 or 15 minutes or whatever it sets that up. So that, in essence, is how you set up the container registry and connect it to Spring One. I've already set that up, and I connected it. So it's ready to go. So we've got our container registry. We've got our app that we know works. We've got our Kubernetes service. The Kubernetes service right now is empty. It's blank. But let me show you how you actually set that up, connect to it from your local machine, and then deploy. I went through those steps. There we go. Okay, so you have to go AZACR install CLI, and that installs kubectl on your local machine and sets up your connection with the Kubernetes environment. You may have to set your path. This is a note for me because I learned this the hard way. You do have to set your path in there so you can use kubectl next time when you log out. And that's important. Next up, you go AZACR get credentials. So this is, once again, is the Azure CLI. I should describe the Azure CLI a little bit. So it's written in Python. It's available on Windows, Mac, and Linux. It's a download. It's built into several things. In the case of what I'm using here with Windows Subsystem for Linux, which is Ubuntu, I do have to download it and update it inside of my Windows Subsystem for Linux. So that's important. But it's really easy to set up. You also have something called the Cloud Shell when you're working with Azure, as shell.azure.com. And that actually has a pre-built, up-to-date version of the CLI built into it as well. But this Azure CLI command, AZACR get credentials, it chooses the credentials you need and overwrites the existing. I already did that, so I already set up the credentials. So my local machine is actually connecting already, and as you can see, it's ready, but there's actually nothing running. There's just an agent pool sitting there ready to go, but there's actually no pods or nodes running at the moment for AZACR. So the next thing we want to do, and I already set this up, was kube control create secret. So as you recall, when I'm running this locally and running it in Docker, I have to have an environment variable called app configuration connection string to actually make this run. That app configuration connection string in Kubernetes needs to be in a secret, and it is hashed base 64. But basically what happens is the application itself needs to find that connection string to run. Otherwise, you get an error when you start the pod in Kubernetes. So all I have to do to set that up is kube control create secret generic app config string. And then I use the actual environment variable that's on my local machine. I use the from literal parameter app configuration connection string equals the environment variable. So it takes the environment variable from my local machine, passes it to Kubernetes, hashes it, and sets it up. I'll show you what that looks like. So if I go into my Spring One Magic, let's just make sure I set it up actually, and I go into configuration. Over here, you'll see secrets. And yeah, it's in app config string. Inside of app config string is my app configuration connection string. So good, it's there, it's ready to go. And what's going to happen now is when I deploy to my Kubernetes application from the container registry, it's going to run that for me. All right, we're doing pretty good for time here. The deployment file itself uses the app config string. Let's see here. Right, so the next thing you need to do is you actually want to do the deployment. The application itself has a end URL that you want to use. This is a customized URL. And the URL itself, you want to add to your YAML file. So what you do is you say AZACR show, and then you choose the Azure Kubernetes service, and then you check the add-on profiles, HTTP application routing, and you want to have the routing zone name, and you want to put that to a table. We're going to do a deployment using a YAML file. The YAML file is in the repo. It's called Spring Boot Docker. Now, the YAML file we have here actually works with the connection string. Where is that here? Yeah, there it is. Okay, so let's just start from the top. So this connection, this deployment actually creates a instance called Spring Boot Docker, and it uses the application. We're going to connect to the container registry that we used already. So we don't want Spring Boot Docker. That's the demo I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. We want Spring One Magic now. And we're going to use the Spring Boot Docker event, the Spring Boot Docker instance in the container registry. So Spring1 magic.azurcr.io needs to be changed. So we were connecting to that. The app configuration connection string, that can stay the way it is. That's the one that passes the environment variable that's in that secret to the application when it's running. But the reason why I got that HTTP add-on is I need to change this here to, whoops. I need to change this and make sure the period is there. It's the part I hate. It doesn't automatically generate for you, but you just need to hand code it. The hand coding is always an issue when you're doing a live demo. Okay, so there you go. So this is basically going to now connect to Spring Boot Docker. It's going to connect to that new instance of AKS that we've got. When we do AKS show Spring1 magic, and we check the HTTP application routing, this is the actual routing that we want to use inside of the Spring Boot Docker instance. We're going to use port 8080 for everything. So when I save this, I already saved it. So we now connect to Spring1 magic, and then we connect to, when the application is actually running, we're going to use this instance to run it. All right, so if I go back to demo steps here, I already described all that. So we're going to do kube control apply Spring Boot Docker YAML. Fingers crossed. Yay. Okay, so we got a Spring Boot Docker instance created. We got a service created. That's the ingress, and the ingress itself is going to connect now based on the parameters that we set in our Spring Boot Docker YAML file. So when you're actually doing this yourself, if you want to go out to the repo, as I mentioned, all you need to do is change two things. You need to change the name of your container registry where you're actually going to be pulling things, and then you need to change the name of your host to make sure that it connects when it's actually running. All right. Now we can check the pods. See what we got here. We got one running. Yay. Still running. Still running. I like to check it. And then you can check the logs to see how your application is doing. And this is going to take, usually it varies, but it could take a couple of minutes. Let's go here. Logs. So yeah, there we go. So the application is actually running. Same message you get when you're running it in Docker. So theoretically, we should be able to go to that URL now. If I go to, let's go back up here to my YAML file. From here, I should be able to get to, let's build a new one. Yes. Feature. Let's hope this works. Sometimes it takes a minute to start. Yeah, that's okay. Advanced. It's okay. Hey, my feature is enabled. All right. So now if we go to our configuration manager, we can see here, turn that off, update the feature flag. And what that does is from then on, I can go back to my new repo. Sometimes it takes a second. Sometimes it takes more than a second. There we go. My feature is disabled. And yes, I will make that bigger. Sorry. All right. So that works. So everything's deployed. So let's just review what we did here. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can actually troubleshoot this as well, if you need to. If for some reason something didn't work in your configuration or your deployment, you can do kubectl rollout restart deployment Spring Boot Docker, and it's basically going to redeploy this out to the pod. You can do scaling, you can do all kinds of things, but this actually auto scales. So if we want to do auto scale of this, it'll actually do that as well, and it'll run and scale up to 5 pods. Okay, so that's it for that part of the demo. Now, part of the title of our presentation is GitHub Actions, so we're going to move on to that next. But let's just review. So we went in, we ran a application locally. We created a Kubernetes cluster and a container registry. We used AZACR Build to deploy out to the container registry. And then we manually connected to the Kubernetes cluster from there. So from there, we were able to run that Azure, that deployment for the kubectl deployment. And that deployment with the settings we customized was able to do a deployment out to the Kubernetes cluster for us. So that is in essence is how you get it out to the cloud. You get your deployment and your Spring Boot app to Kubernetes the first time. So how do you actually keep maintaining that? There's a couple of ways you can do that. So the first one is if I go into my, this is my GitHub repo. If I go into the GitHub repo, I can actually say, where is it now? Oh, I have to go to actions. Never mind. And then I can say new workflow. So setting up a GitHub Actions is actually your easiest way to do this. There's other ways, including JFrog and others for deployments as well. But in this case, you can use a workflow here, and there is a workflow deployed to AKS. So I can configure this, but there's an easier way. I'm going to show you something. This is you basically have to set up this Kubernetes service here. You have to set up several secrets, and the secrets all have to match the container registry links and the AKS links, and everything you need to set up here. So, and there's also something called a principal ID that you need to set up for a tenant. So a service principal is called. You set up the service principal, and that connects to this as well. So this is actually complicated to set up, but it's a great template to start with. And there's other templates to deploy to different things as well. Amazon, others, we're all friends here. And IBM, et cetera, et cetera. So you can choose a workflow here, or there's an actual easier way to set this up. It's a rather new way to do it. If I go into my Spring One Magic cluster and I go down to automated deployments. So automated deployments is kind of a cool thing. It allows me to create an automatic deployment. It's going to connect. I'll just show you what it does. I can name this Spring One demo. And I can choose the repository I want to use. This is annoying. They're not in alphabetical order, so you have to go to Spring. Hey, just a second here. Spring One. Still too many. Spring Boot. Sorry. Spring Boot feature flags. Yeah, that's the one I called it. Why isn't it there? That's weird. Just a moment. Feature flags. There it is. I don't know. Maybe it was there. I just couldn't see it. Folks out there are probably going, it's right there. All right. So then you go to the main branch. So what we're doing here is we're actually going to connect out to GitHub, and it's going to get some information about this. And then it's going to use the Dockerfile build context that we have in the local file. And it's going to use the Dockerfile for that. And then the Azure Container Registry we're going to use is the one that we set up already called Spring One Magic. There it is at the top. And then the image we're going to use is Spring Boot Docker. Then we're going to use the deployment. Oh, Dockerfile is required. Yes. Okay. Whoops. So this connects actually out to my GitHub repo. Yes. All right. So the build context, I missed that. So the Docker, next deployment details. You can use the Helm chart if you have it, Kubernetes manifest, and you can choose the manifest. In this case, the deployment file that we have will work just fine. Spring Boot Docker YAML. Select, and you can create a new namespace for this, or you can use one of the ones you already have. I use default because default's already there, and then you can review it. So what this is going to do, I've already got one set up, so I'm not going to deploy this yet. But when you do deploy it, actually, I'll go ahead and do that. What it does is actually creates a pull request, and then you go out and approve the pull request, which I won't do for now because I already have one created. And what happens is, I'll explain it to you in a minute what happens. Okay. Come on. It's supposed to tell me something. It's supposed to tell me to go to the pull request is still being created. There we go. Approve the pull request. So what this will do is it takes me out to my GitHub repo. And for now, I will not merge this pull request, and I'll show you why in a second. It's because I've already created one. And the code is really good. It's nice. It's automated. But if you create more than one, you see down here, I have these secrets set up. It starts conflicting. It overwrites secrets. It's not good. So if you want to do that, it's okay. But you're going to have a little bit of merge conflicts, if you will, with your secrets that get set up here for the actual action. So I won't do that. And what I'll do instead is I'll run the one that I already created. But let me talk a little bit about how it works. Actually, let's run it, and then we'll do that. Actions. Okay, E2E deployment. I disabled it because it automatically runs every time there's a push, and we didn't really want that. Okay, so the run workflow. Okay, so what this is going to do is it's basically going to take anything that I've changed, which I haven't in this case. It's going to run the workflow. It's going to deploy it. So what's in this when it's deploying? Let's go ahead and talk about that. So the first thing we do is any push on the main branch, you use the resource group that I created. This is the old one, Spring Boot Docker. And then use Spring Boot Docker YAML. Then you do a read, a write, and you deploy using Ubuntu latest. I'll explain what that is in a minute. That's what we call a hosted runner on GitHub. And then you check out the code. So it's basically going to create the code. This runs in a container, as I mentioned before, a hosted runner. It's checking the code into the hosted runner. It's going to log in using the service principal that I created automatically here, using this client ID, the subscription ID, the tenant ID. And then it's going to do, hey, this looks familiar, huh? Let me make this bigger. AZACR Build. So that's the same command I used to get it from my local machine to deploy it. AZACR Build takes an image container name. It's going to use a GitHub hash. It uses a hash algorithm based on MD5 to identify, instead of saying V1 or anything like that, it's going to create a new version and it's going to use a hash for the identifier. And then it goes to the registry that you've actually already created. And that's off the screen, but that's okay. And then you have permissions for this, for the deployment itself. So that's the build stage, building the image. And then you have a deployment. The deployment's actually going to check out the code again to another hosted runner. This takes the results of the Dockerfile build. It logs in again, and it deploys out to Kubernetes for you from the container registry. So that's where it's actually going to do the deployment image from this container registry, the container name, and that hash key that we identify as the identifier instead of v1. And then it's going to use the deployment manifest. That's that YAML file that deploys out to Kubernetes. So that's basically how that works. Let's see how it's going. Why didn't it work? Let's see, build image. Interesting. Oh, you know why? Because I screwed up. I'm using Spring Boot Docker, but my credentials are set for Spring One Magic. So this is the old version, and I am not logged in with that. So when I created this, if you recall, I used Spring One Magic, and this one is not going to work with that particular credential. So anyway, I'll debug that later, but I did want to show you that, and it basically deploys as shown as long as you set up your credentials right. So how do you set up those credentials? If you go to settings, secrets, you can have secrets for actions, code spaces, and dependent upon. I'm going to cover code spaces in a minute because I think we have time. So actions themselves, I've got, some people might notice I've got app configuration connection string in here. I didn't actually need it because I use the build. I use dskip tests. So I don't actually need it at this point, but I've got it there if I need it, if I ever want to test the runtime during the deployment of an application from a GitHub action. This is the client ID, subscription ID, and tenant ID. So those were updated. They were updated with the new credentials. This is the problem. They were updated with the new credentials. Remember I described that if you create something on top of this, there's all kinds of collisions and problems. Yeah, that's what I just did. I screwed this up. So I thought it wouldn't create these credentials until you do the merge, but it didn't. It did them now before the merge happens. So that's my bad. I'd have to run that whole thing again. I don't think we have time for that, but it works. If you have the right credentials in here, you can see it was updated 5 minutes ago, but the actual action itself was created. If I go in here to the code, it was actually created 14 hours ago. So, so the credentials don't match. That's why it's not working. Okay. Anyway, moving on. Hosted runners. I want to talk a little bit about that. So hosted runners are the way that GitHub manages all this stuff. If I go into Spring Boot feature flags, one of the cool things, everyone's familiar here with local, you can clone this to your local machine. But what if you don't want to clone it to your local machine? What if you want to edit things locally? Well, you can go in here to your workflow, right? You can go in here and you can open this YAML file and you can edit this file, right? So you can edit it here, but that's not really good practice because someone else might be editing it and you're going to get all kinds of merge conflicts, et cetera, et cetera. So code spaces are pretty cool. You have choices. You can clone this with your local machine. Or you can set up code spaces and just create a code space. The code space itself, basically what it does is it runs on one of those GitHub hosted runners. It creates a container and it creates the code. So I'm not looking directly into the repo here. I'm looking at a clone of the repo on a container in the browser in the web. So let's say I need to edit my YAML file. I can do that from here. It's kind of cool too. And the other thing I want to show you, oh, there we go. So now we got the full color coding, everything's there. The other nice thing is that I can not only edit things here, but I have stuff that's available to me. For example, if I go into my code, Java. I'll go into Hello World features. And I just want to do a comment here. Come on, code. I'm trying to show you something here that is pretty cool. Nope. Hey, as you can see here, it automatically sets up a bash instance for me as well. I can create bash and other things as well. And you can set up terminal settings to do other things, other command line systems too. But I really wanted to show you this, and I was hoping it would work. Oh, come on, Copilot. I wanted to show you this thing called Copilot, which you've probably already heard about, but Copilot's pretty cool, and it does work in code spaces normally, not today apparently, but Copilot is a way to automatically set up code for you, which is cool.
There's a couple questions. There's a question of whether VS Code is the default IDE for CodeSpace.
Yes, it is the default IDE for CodeSpace. So when you're using CodeSpaces, VS Code is the default. And the thing is, you can create you can open this in VS Code locally, and I think you can also open this in IntelliJ. I can't remember right now, but I believe that is an option. So you can actually open a CodeSpaces instance locally in IntelliJ as well. So that's an option. It does have some extensions. And the reason why you'd want to do that is the extensions here, if you have any installed, I don't have any extensions installed, as you can see here. All of these are to be installed, but are not actually set up. So you can actually run this in a local instance inside of VS Code. You can connect to your code space. So you're working in a container in the cloud, but from your local machine. And I believe you can do that in IntelliJ as well. Hopefully that answers the question.
So are there no extensions that are installed by default for like Java or anything? Because yeah, one of the questions was if you could show your extensions, but I guess you're looking at that. But
well, no, the question here is, yeah, for this one, if you notice down here at the bottom, let me see if I can make this bigger. Yeah. Do you want to install recommended extensions for Java? I can install these, and then I can set up something called a dev container. And if I set up, so I can set up my extensions exactly the way I like them. And then you create this thing called the dev container, which is basically a JSON file that goes with the repo. So the next time somebody opens this repo in CodeSpaces, it will install all the extensions for you. So hopefully that answers that question. But if they're asking about my VS Code extensions, I can show that here as well. I've got a lot of extensions. So everything is, I got to reload some. The GitHub pull request, there's a lot of Java support, Azure CLI tools, and it's too many to go over here. But I've got a few extensions. The nice thing about CodeSpaces is I install extensions in my local VS Code for certain particular products and projects, and then maybe I don't need them all that much. So I can create a dev container that only in here has the actual extensions I need for any particular purpose. And so, like I say, once I install extensions, I can save that image, and it will save a JSON file on my local GitHub called the dev container, and that dev container will do that for you. But the extension pack for Java, I think there's a question here about you want to move the VS Code from Eclipse to code Java. The extension pack for Java is the first thing you want to install. The extension pack for Java can be installed in CodeSpaces or in Visual Studio Code as well. So, yeah, as you can see, it's got a few downloads, 17 million. So, a few folks using it. I think we're coming up on the hour. The only thing that didn't happen is those actions didn't work because of the credentials. But if you set that up properly, not like I did, it will run and it will actually deploy your updates. And the thing I did want to show is I'm going to make a change here in my code spaces, and then I was going to push that to my repo. Unfortunately, I won't be able to do that. We're out of time. So But yeah, that's essentially it. I did want to just share a link as a last thing. So you can go to DevOps or JavaShops.com. There's more information there, which has all the outlines. And the repo itself is on my personal repo at Benz Spring Boot Feature Flags. So hopefully that's good. If there's any more questions, I guess, do we have more time at all, Tiffany? Or
I mean, I'm cool with you trying to spend a little more time to get things working.
Oh no, I won't be able to do that. I'm going to have to redeploy it, and I'm going to have to delete a bunch of stuff. So I'm going to leave it there. But trust me, it works if you set up the credentials correctly. So I screwed that up.
Yeah, there's a comment saying great stuff. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you, Senate. Appreciate that. Yeah, I'm having a look at the comments now. I was busy looking up at my demo screen here. So yeah. And Kasim, I hope I answered the questions about the extensions for VS Code, for code spaces as well. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Well, if there's no more questions, I think we can probably just wrap it up. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks, Brian, so much for doing this. This is really cool. I had played a little bit with like GitHub Actions earlier in the year, but like seeing more of the different things that like people can actually do with them is really cool too. Because it was totally new for me a little bit ago, and it's still pretty new. So yeah.
Oh, they're so cool.
Awesome.
What's that? Sorry.
I said, so this is super awesome.
Yeah, no, they're really nice. Go to GitHub Marketplace. So GitHub Actions Marketplace, just search that. And any kind of action you're looking for, someone's probably already built one and they've shared it. They're free and available. So GitHub Actions are really cool stuff. And like I say, it runs in that hosted runner. So if you have a situation where you have low bandwidth or you have limited processing power on your local machine, you can fire up a code space and some GitHub Actions and do things that way. And it's actually a pretty handy way to go. I do that in hotels sometimes or wherever things are limited. So yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't know about CodeSpace before either. So just all the new things.
Yeah, no, very cool. And I wanted to show you Copilot, but it didn't work. I can show you in VS Code, but this is there's a whole hour I can spend on Copilot too, that's the AI. So it actually generates code for you based on whatever you're looking for. So you can type public class and it will actually create a whole class based on the name. Say area of a circle, it'll create area of a circle. It'll create the class for you that actually with working code. So it's pretty cool.
That is cool. Doing math for me.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks again. And thanks everyone for coming. And we're doing this pretty much every Tuesday and Thursday. So keep coming back. I wanted to share a few other things. So we have Spring Academy. If you want to basically take some courses to learn more stuff with Spring, go to spring.academy. And then also we have, which I mentioned at the beginning, we have VMware Explorer which is paired this time with Spring One. I didn't mention the VMware Explorer part, but basically we have both of those happening, and it'll be August 21st through 24th in Las Vegas. So it'd be really cool to see folks there. So yeah, thanks again, everyone.